Welcome. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Stantec Water webinar series. We are pleased to present Drew Whitlock, our Global Practice Leader for Biosolids and Energy Recovery, who is speaking on the changes of U.S. federal incentives and how they will drive expansion of the biogas and anaerobic digestion markets. I am Heather Dean, your hostess. During this meeting, you will be in listen-only mode. We invite you to submit questions at any time during the presentation. If you're joining via computer, you can do so by expanding the questions box in the side panel of your screen. If you are on a mobile device, click the question mark located at the top of your screen. Your questions will be addressed following the presentation. And with that, Drew, I will kick it over to you to get us started.
Thanks so much, Heather, and good morning, good afternoon to all those who are attending today. So the agenda today that we'll be going through will include primarily focusing on two market drivers. One is the Renewable Fuel Standard and the other is the Inflation Reduction Act. So I'll do an overview of each of those and then some of the impacts that we are currently seeing, as well as anticipate further impacts as these drivers take hold and some of the funding comes through. So what the market drivers include: an integration of organics management, regionalization, activity in the bioindustrial ag space, and P3 activity. So before we get into that, I'm going to provide a quick health and safety moment. So this will be a focus on health. And for those of you who have not participated in acquiring one of these lovely instruments, these wearable biometric technology devices, I think are pretty amazing in providing feedback, and the feedback keeps getting better and better. What you see in front of you is a Garmin Fenix 7. It's the watch that I currently own, and I've had several iterations of the Garmin. I have friends and know others who have other types of wearable devices, and they all have similar functionality, but this is the one that I use and I've been very happy with. And like everything else, logging activities, whether it's just steps or if you have a specific activity that you enjoy doing, that logging those, at least in my experience, is a solid way to develop habits that you want to implement. So just having these devices, having an interface with online devices and taking advantage of that, not letting it rule everything, but using it in a way that helps you develop the habits that you want. I've personally found that that's a good way to use that kind of technology. So with that, we'll get into the agenda. We'll start with the Renewable Fuel Standard and also talk a bit about the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, provide an overview of those programs, a little bit of background, and how those are shaping markets and how those are currently evolving. So one thing I want to go through is just some definitions and where the markets, we see most of the activity, at least in the municipal space, in this activity. And also I want to make sure that when I talk about certain things that we all understand what those are. I hear in our industry now, because there's so much activity and there's a lot of overlap with so many other industries and disciplines these days, I think there's a bit of confusion about when we say biogas, what that means. So biogas itself is simply the raw product from anaerobic processes. And those anaerobic processes can be an anaerobic digester, it can be an anaerobic lagoon, it can be anaerobic processes within a municipal solid waste facility. All of those produce biogas. And biogas is the raw product that comes off of these types of mechanisms that are shown on the left. Biogas is typically, at least from a wastewater process standpoint, it's typically about 60% methane, has a lower heating value, somewhere around 550 to 600 BTU per standard cubic foot. And then the rest of the of the gas is primarily CO2, although depending on the constituents or the substrate going into these processes on the left, there can be varying concentrations of hydrogen sulfide, which typically is needing to be removed. For our wastewater treatment processes, we see organosiloxanes that are in the wastewater and that can evolve into the biogas and cause issues downstream. So those siloxanes typically need to be removed. And then there's sort of a transformation process. So the two processes that are most active in the biogas space, and we've seen this over many decades when we look at combined heat and power units. So if I say CHP, I mean combined heat and power. Combined heat and power is simply taking the gas, combusting it, and converting that to electricity. And then depending on the power conversion efficiency, you get a certain amount of power from that, and then there's going to be waste heat from that. So the waste heat at many utilities can be recovered and reused. And then on the lower part here, the RNG, when we talk about RNG, that is an upgrading of the gas. So as I mentioned, that there's about 40% or so, depending on the process on the left, but 40% CO2 in this in the biogas, and that needs to be removed so that it meets natural gas utility requirements or natural gas requirements for the purpose it's being used for, which can be different, and each utility has different requirements. So, but effectively what we're doing with RNG is we're taking the methane component, which is about 60%, we're keeping that, and then we're removing the CO2, and then what's left over is methane, which is the same molecule, of course, in fossil natural gas. And then that can be used in a natural gas vehicle. And then again, with the CHP system, the power can be used on site, the heat can be used on site, and then there's electric vehicles that can be fueled from this as well. The reason why I'm showing specifically vehicles in this process train that you're seeing here is that these incentive programs, the Renewable Fuel Standard and the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, require that these fuels go to a vehicle, and the vehicle needs to use it in a way that the pathway has been created by the regulating entity, whether that's Environmental Protection Agency or State of California. The Renewable Fuel Standard, just a bit of history on it. There's a lot of history, and these are just some selected points along the way. This originated in 2005, and it was under the Energy Policy Act. And then the Renewable Fuel Standard 1 was in 2007. By the way, these are acts of Congress, so it's literally an act of Congress that brought these in place. When these were enacted and first came out, they're really focused on biofuels associated with ethanol production. So much of the paradigm or the construct that has been developed by the Environmental Protection Agency as a function of the law that was enacted by Congress and originally approved by the Bush administration in 2005. All of those things are really focused a lot on the ethanol production. So some of the language, when you get into the details of the Renewable Fuel Standard, and you wonder why it's shaped that way, it's because it's an ethanol program that's evolved from there, where other pathways have been developed in order to expand the program. But it's still primarily an ethanol program. So when you go to fill it in the U.S. and when you go to fill up your vehicle and you see ethanol in the gasoline, that's a derivative of the Renewable Fuel Standard. So the RFS 2 was enacted subsequent to that, and it retired some of the D codes that I'll explain later. And then the cellulosic renewable identification number pathway was activated subsequent to that. And then we started seeing the cellulosic RINs being traded around 2014. There was a change in the D3, D5 rule in 2005. So at that point, if you were processing cellulosic and non-cellulosic feedstock, you pretty much were relegated to a D5 RIN, and I'll show the implications of that in subsequent slides here. There were also changes in 2018 for the small refinery exemption rule, and there a lot of these interpretation and changes have impacts on the trading rate of the RIN itself, and I want you to just remember that there was that 2018 small refinery exemption, because I'm going to show you the impact of that in a subsequent slide. And then currently, there's a set rule that's being developed by EPA and finalized this year that included an eRIN pathway activation, updating volume obligations. The volume obligations are now set by EPA, and those volume obligations essentially provide the demand for the RIN trading. They set the demand for these various D codes. The other change was there was a change also back to how the D3, D5 splits are accounted for, and that's been clarified. And then there is a biogas reform modification as well that's going into place now. So this is showing the trading platform of physical attributes that are being exchanged, as well as the fungible assets that are being traded, and from a renewable natural gas standpoint. So if you look from left to right on this process flow diagram, it shows the feedstocks, and similarly, as I showed earlier, where the feedstocks can be wastewater residuals, they can be material going into the landfill, they can be swine manure, they can be other materials that go into processes that produce this biogas. There are various conversion technologies that produce that, and then refining it to biogas to RNG. That's typically put out on the pipeline, but there are other ways to convey that material to the final offtake, including fueling vehicles on site. So it doesn't have to go to a natural gas utility. You can fuel vehicles on site, but typically it's going into a natural gas pipeline. And then there's a gas offtake someplace in the United States at a final destination. And then you have this, at this point, you have this RIN creation. And then the RIN is sold to an obligated party. And then the obligated party is generally provides the funding back to the producer via a broker, although the exchange can take place without a broker. So that's kind of the pathway. As I indicated before, these RINs are traded on the market. The renewable volume obligations affect the supply. On the demand side of things, just one example of I mentioned that small refinery exemption. So there's no expectation that this law is going to go away. It would take an act of Congress to remove it. But the executive branch of the government interprets the rules and modifies the rules and directs the EPA to make those changes. And then when those changes are implemented, that can affect the value of the renewable identification number. So I mentioned the small refinery exemption. If you look about 2018, when you look at the D3 RIN price, when the small refinery exemption took place, so that's exempting, is the interpretation of the rule for exempting what's categorized as small refineries, you can see that the price of the RIN dropped dramatically as a result of that and started to build its way back under different regimes, administrative regimes. But these kind of things you can expect, and they're sort of built into the model. And you know, as you're contemplating your willingness or appetite to participate in these programs and how you're going to manage the risk and your fiduciary responsibility to your ratepayers as a public entity, you have to understand that these are volatile markets and there will be changes, and understanding that to the best extent possible, having the information and understanding the risk is the way forward. This is a daily RIN update that I receive from Eco Engineers. Eco Engineers, by the way, is very active in this space, has excellent resources to provide guidance to folks. I'd say they've been very collaborative in our space for our various clients, and I just subscribe to this, and I recommend if you're interested in this market, you get the subscription as well. But I get almost on a daily basis, I get updates and the RIN values. And so EPA, the previous chart was provided by EPA, it lags a little bit. This isn't spot on value, but it's gives you a good idea of where the markets are trading of these RIN values. And if you just put your eye on D3 RIN and the D5 RIN, in 2023, we're trading right now about $3 per RIN for D3 and $1.40, call it $1.40 range for the D5 RIN. Those are the two RINs that are most actively traded in our space right now. So again, the obligated parties are these are oil refiners or importers into the U.S. The big names that you see on top are the ones that are primarily trading in this space, and each party is allocated a certain amount of volume obligations that they have to fulfill on an annual basis. These also require them to satisfy, you know, the cellulosic waiver, or excuse me, cellulosic credits that apply to the D3 RIN. This is a process that's been in place, you know, again, since back, you know, in the early to mid aughts, and it's well established, and the process itself is fairly streamlined at this point. As I mentioned before, there was an RFS1 and RFS2. RFS1 retired D1 and D2 codes, and so now we have D3 through D7 codes. The main thing with these codes is that they apply to the quantity of greenhouse gas reduction that's associated with the feedstock itself, the type of processing that's associated with the feedstock, and what type of fuel it can achieve. So these D3 RINs are considered the most valuable because they have the most greenhouse gas reduction. They require a significant quantity of what EPA deems a cellulosic content. So that's material that doesn't break down very well. So sugar, fat, things like that, you know, that in our bodies and in these processes break down very easily. You know, the cellulosic content, the celery that we eat or things akin to that don't break down quite as easily and have a higher value in that regard. Okay, so recent changes to the Renewable Fuel Standard. One is so in November or December of 2022, EPA put out a wide-ranging document indicating that there are going to be several changes to the Renewable Fuel Standard, and there's been a long-awaited activation of the eRIN pathway. And so the eRIN pathway is taking biofuels and converting those to electricity and then using the electricity to fuel electric vehicles. The pathway was created some time ago, but it has not yet been activated by EPA. So there was a lot of anticipation and excitement when EPA provided guidance on how that was going to be conducted. And then the constructs of the rule were starting to come out. And then just recently this year, EPA indicated that the ERIN pathway activation is going to be delayed. And they said they received a lot of comments associated with the approach that they're using and the methodologies and so forth. And so they're re-examining those. I would expect, and in talking with other folks who are savvy in the industry, that this will probably occur later this year. But if they don't get to it this year, I think it's going to be tough for them to do that activation in 2024, with it being an election year. So maybe kick down the road a year or two. There are pending lawsuits associated with activating this pathway. It seems that EPA is very motivated to activate the pathway as well. So I'll get into the details of how and why that's important from a monetization standpoint here in these subsequent slides. And it just provides other opportunities for biogas utilization in our space. And again, I think this is an important part of the RFS. I think it's going to be passed or activated at some point, but it may be sometime down the road. There are a lot of details with how EPA originally developed the methodology for RIN activation, who's responsible, and the parties involved in that. And if there are questions around that, we can get into the details of that later. They also provided some clarification on how to account for D3 and D5 RINs. So as shown on that previous slide, D3 RIN currently is worth $3, and D5 RINs worth currently about $1.40. So obviously getting as much D3 RIN as possible is desired. And for a lot of our clients who are attending today, the cellulosic content for various substrates going into these processes is the determination of whether it achieves a D3 or a D5 RIN. So in particular, at a wastewater treatment facility, your primary sludge, your waste activated sludge, this material has been deemed by EPA as meeting the cellulosic content requirement. So if you're processing that alone, you will get a D3 RIN currently and into the future. Now, if you're co-processing material, if you bring in fats, oils, and greases, if you bring in food waste, if you bring in some high-strength industrial waste that don't meet the cellulosic criteria, up until now, everything would be, if you're again co-processing that in the same reactor, everything would be relegated to a D5 RIN. So it's in a way the interpretation change in 2016 timeframe really disincentivized co-processing material or co-digesting material. So EPA has set up now a mechanism to account for those. As I look at the methodology that they're using for if you use the default approach, it's basically, it's using basic accounting. So something in the neighborhood of, if you're getting a 50% volatile solids reduction with 80% VS volatile solids to total solids ratio, you're getting a typical biogas yield of 15 standard cubic feet per pound of volatile solids destroyed, and a typical higher heating value. The translation number they're using for that to account for D3 quantity is, to me, it's pretty solid. If you want to, you can also set your own accounting by setting up the reactor for a certain period of time to show how much biogas you're producing and the performance of that to set the D3. But either way, you can get now, if you have various substrates going into the reactor, you can account for the material associated with biogas production for D3 RIN and the material associated with biogas produced for D5 RIN. So that really that change, I think, is a positive outcome and will enable treatment facilities to co-process material with a lot more alacrity at this point. The volume obligations have been set for 23 through 25. They're mostly good. For D3 RINs, they seem to be quite aggressive in combination with some of the delays on the ERIN pathway. Looks like D3 RIN is really going to be in good shape. So those are good outcomes. And EPA may modify those as they go forward. They'll be reassessing and so forth and trying to, I think, set the RVOs at the appropriate amount to incentivize the market appropriately. These changes, some of them have already gone into effect. Some of them will go effective in January of 2024. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit briefly, just transitioning to the low carbon fuel standard that's based on carbon intensity analysis for the state of California. Some of you may ask, why are we talking about California? Well, this particular incentive, especially for RNG production, can incentivize anyone putting RNG onto the natural gas utility grid anywhere in the United States. And so it, it's not just an incentive for the state of California, it's an incentive in all parts of the country. Similar to the renewable fuel standard, the low carbon fuel standard is about transportation fuel. And the way EPA has this set up is that they've set carbon intensity requirements through 2030. And this is simply a chart showing how gasoline and diesel carbon intensity requirements will change over that period of time. So if you are a fossil fuel company and your CI score along, in any given year, if your carbon intensity score is above these goals, then you need to purchase credits. And if you are a renewable energy producer with a carbon intensity that's below these goals, then you get a credit and you can sell that on the market. It's a carbon trading market. So if you notice back on the eco-engineer providing, they provided the value of the carbon trading on that market, but it's all a function of this carbon intensity. And as this becomes a little more relevant as I talk in a subsequent part of this, I'm going to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. The state of California has uses the modified GREET model for calculating these carbon intensities. You can use default carbon intensities for various substrates and processes, or you can calculate it yourself. I do know of clients who are getting low carbon fuel standard credits, and they've gotten better CI or carbon intensity scores by going through this GREET model and applying to get a better score, so that the value of the credit is higher. But as I talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, this GREET model becomes a little more relevant at this point, so I'll be referencing back to this slide. State of California, in addition to this low carbon fuel standard that's incentivized through AB 32, they have SB 1383, which is a landfill diversion requirement. That's really supposed to be going into effect now and active by 2025. I think there have been some delays for various reasons, but nevertheless, state of California's intent on through this SB 1383, which is a broad-ranging bill that's going to affect a lot of things, but for our industry, essentially diverting organics from the landfill will be required and mandated through this program. It's not just a goal, it's a mandate that will be going into effect. And as we know, what happens in the state of California is highly relevant in other areas. I already mentioned AB 32. There's also an executive order that requires carbon neutrality by 2045, and that became an act of Congress through SB 100. So the state of California has a number of things happening. I think it's important to pay attention to these things, because as they get rolled out and how effective they are can be potentially implemented by other states and by the federal government as well. So getting into the value, risk, and cost of these various credits. This just simply shows the value of the gas based on various scenarios on the left-hand side, and the utilized annual costs that are represented on the right-hand side. This was a chart that was developed for a client a number of years ago, but it's still relevant today, and it shows how the value of the RNG on the left-hand side is associated with the cost based on different scenarios, based on the value of the market. So long and short is that, folks have been doing pretty well, and this, the probable outcome here where you're making, some money on the gas, I'd say we're somewhere between the probable and optimistic area, depending on the trading value at any given time. And folks are doing pretty well. And the individuals who have invested in this technology and taken on the risk, I think, are reaping the benefits of that. It does also show that without the incentives, it's very difficult to produce RNG economically. In fact, you're losing money based on this model when you include debt service and all the O&M costs associated with this. So it's the incentives become highly relevant, and it's important. When we look at these alternatives, again, I showed earlier, taking the biogas, and depending on how we're using it, there are going to be treatment technologies that have to be implemented, and then the utilization you can see over on the right. When we look at the value, this gets back to the importance of this ERIN, and when we look at the valuation of these based on current trading attributes. So here's how the math works. So if we're looking at all D3 RINs and you're producing that, and over on the left-hand side, when we calculate, translate these to how they compare in units that we're typically used to in this trading space. So like a D3 RIN, if it's valued at $3, EPA has put the energy equivalents for the ERIN based on the recent guidance at 6.5 kilowatt hours per RIN, which, by the way, is a big improvement over the previous valuation of 22.6 kilowatt hours per RIN. So with the new energy equivalence value, you can convert the ERIN to dollars using that $3 divided by the 6.5 kilowatt hours per RIN, and that translates to 46 cents a kilowatt hour. So that's the raw value of that. And if I just want to, compare that in terms of, what does that really compare to an RNG RIN, I need to do some other conversions. So one of those is to convert it to a BTU. So there's 3,412 BTU per kilowatt hour. If we use a very high power conversion efficiency of a contemporary engine generator these days, we can some of those can get up to 40% power conversion efficiency. So if I'm taking the 46 cents and using the other conversion, then the value of that in RNG terms is $54 per million BTU. Math is a little more simple. If we move over to the right-hand side there, the D3 ran at $3 energy equivalency of an RNG RIN is 11.7 RINs per million BTU. So if I take the 11.7, multiply it by the 3, then I get $35 per million BTU. For an apples to apples comparison, you probably need to account for the natural gas being used specifically at a wastewater treatment facility where you still have to heat the reactor. Typically that's purchased through arbitrage arrangement. It's purchased, the natural gas is purchased back from the national utility after you export 100% of the RNG to maximize the value of that. So there's going to be a little bit of loss from that as well. But folks, this ERIN value shows how important this is and having options. So the RNG value, at $35 per million BTU is awesome. And so when we look at the ERIN value at $54, that's incredible as well. this is real money, and having these options in place, depending on the goals and the circumstances of these various utilities. Maybe some of the utilities are thinking, I'm going to do RNG in the short term and convert to CHP in the long term, depending on what these markets look like. So understanding how the incentive programs are going to evolve become an important factor in the adjudication process of what you're going to implement today and tomorrow. There are a lot of uncertainties associated with these. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention these. I already talked about supply and demand changes affecting market fluctuation. The rule changes affect the supply and the demand, and therefore can affect the value of the RIN. Future volume obligations look solid, but they will be changing, and that affects the supply and demand. There could be changes in legislation, although unlikely. And then, we have something in the neighborhood of 200 natural gas utilities across North America. And so each one, if you're putting your RNG out onto that pipeline, you're going to have to interface with that utility. I think that the paradigm for natural gas utilities is evolving quickly, and they're much more accustomed to handling that, but 5 years ago they weren't. So that is still something to take into account. All right, I'm going to transition now. Let me just do a time check. I'm going to transition now to the Inflation Reduction Act. I'll hit this pretty quickly, and then we'll get on to some conclusion slides with this. But the Inflation Reduction Act is an expansion of the investment tax credits that have been in place for quite some period of time. Some of the differences here are that tax-exempt entities and the monetization process has been streamlined, as well as other activities like environmental justice, social and environmental requirement attributes have been added to the investment tax credit programs. And for us, the biogas is central to this discussion, but these are wide programs. So I just dropped a list of the tax codes that are shown in the parentheses, and the various programs that are out there. I'll highlight a few. One of those is the hydrogen production. There'll be incentive programs for that. I think there's interest in our industry of taking biogas and stripping off the hydrogen using that. You could do RNG to hydrogen as well. So I think that there's a lot of interest in that particular program, as well as how that market is going to evolve. I think a lot of progressive entities now are also looking at CO2 capture. So, whether you're using your biogas for RNG or CHP, there's going to be a CO2 stream. So with RNG, you're going to be stripping off the CO2, and you have that CO2 stream. So that could be captured, sequestered, or beneficially used in some way, which could make additional eligibility for these programs good. Or if you're looking at CHP, you're basically combusting you're combusting the CO2 as well as the methane, and producing primarily CO2 from that. So that CO2 stream could be captured and sequestered or used beneficially in some way. And so these tax credits could apply to that as well. The advanced manufacturing product credit could be applicable. There's a whole bunch of stuff in here. The EPA, that the IRS will be coming out on some guidance here fairly soon. By the way, it's about a year in to when the law was promulgated now, and I think the IRS has been doing a lot of work, and the guidance documents should be forthcoming to create some clarity on this. This $369 billion that's been allocated is simply the start. There have been entities that have calculated that over the lifespan of the Inflation Reduction Act and how it's going to evolve, that the incentives will be somewhere, maybe between 1.5 and $2 trillion out there that can be realized and will really set the plate for a lot of activity in this space. So on the investment tax credit, I should have mentioned right at the beginning, there are two options for leveraging these types of credits. One is you have to make a choice, and that's you either take the investment tax credit or you take the production tax credit. And the production tax credit, you can realize those credits for something in the neighborhood of 10 years or so. And it really comes down to a business case evaluation of examining, hey, I'm producing this much energy, it's costing me this much to produce. I can either leverage these credits on the production side of things, or I can take the investment tax credit, which is going to reduce the capital investment up front, and I can take that credit. In our initial analyses of these things, it looks like the investment tax credit is a little more advantageous, plus, getting the money sooner can also have other financial benefits. So that seems to be, the right play, but nevertheless, entities might choose to take the production tax credit instead. So the Inflation Reduction Act extends the investment tax credit to the end of 2024, and it includes qualified biogas property projects, which will include RNG projects and be incentivized in that way. So if you're beginning construction, whether you shovels in the ground before the end of 2024, or you spent something in the neighborhood of 5% or more of the capital cost, you can show that construction has begun on your project, and you can qualify for this investment tax credit. After 2024, these traditional extensions of the ITC and PTC programs will be replaced by the Clean Energy ITC and PTC program. And IRS has indicated that the electricity needs to be zero GHG electricity, and I alluded to this carbon intensity score that will likely be governed by the GREET model will indicate whether you meet that requirement or not. It's pretty much technology neutral. So if you're meeting that and producing electricity, out to 2033 or so, you will qualify for this. But some of the guidance documents we're still awaiting. IRS had indicated that some of that guidance was pending, but it's been delayed a little bit. So we're still waiting and expecting to see that sometime in the fall of 2023. So getting to the specifics of the tax credit, you're with all of the bonus credits available to you and so forth, we're looking at up to 50% of the eligible project cost. So the base rate to qualify for the investment tax credit is 6%. If the entities involved satisfy the wage and apprenticeship requirements, then there's an additional 30%. In talking with tax attorneys and accountants who have been active in this space, satisfying this wage and apprenticeship requirement doesn't appear to be too big of a hurdle, and it's such a big incentive to meet that. Seems to be almost baked in. So, what we've been telling our clients is that, for the ITC, you can at least get a 30% decrease in the capital cost associated with the project just by meeting the wage and apprenticeship requirements. This additional 10%, which is stacked on top of the 30% for domestic content, similar to the ERA funding that came out 10 years, 15 years or so now. You have to show that you meet the domestic content. There's been specifics provided for that. It doesn't seem too onerous, but again, this becomes it's somewhat of a financial decision. So I kind of look at, okay, I have to, if I'm purchasing material within the United States, it's going to cost me X. It may be more than that 10%. So you really want to do your due diligence up front and see if it makes sense financially to take advantage of this particular credit. If you're building within what IRS has deemed as energy community and brownfield coal community areas and so forth, that where these energy transitions are impacting workers the most, you can get an additional 10%, but that's very much geographically limited. On the production tax credit, again, it's a 2024 thing. You get 10 years of production. The base rate is 3 cents. If you show, similarly to the ITC, if you show that you're satisfying wage and apprenticeship requirements, you get 5 times that amount. So that's 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour. You get bonuses for domestic content and more bonuses if you're in the energy community. All right, let me zip through these last slides here, and then I think we'll have maybe 15 minutes or so or 10 minutes or so for Q&A. So the impacts of this, there are going to be a lot of impacts of this, but if we kind of look at what we're seeing as sort of traditional market paradigms, and you look at the, wastewater, industrial water, food and beverage, there's a lot of overlap in those industries. Municipal solid waste, in a lot of ways, and still is very much separate. And biofuels, oil and gas, and industrial agriculture, in a lot of ways, historically have been separate. But what we're really seeing is an overall, because of this, these programs, we're already seeing this happen. There's a lot of overlap in these particular areas, and as we start to integrate the co-processing of the materials and so forth, it's being now more streamlined through the incentive processes to do that. You see a lot of overlap there. When you look at just from a kind of a wastewater centric standpoint, this is no longer about process engineering and basic engineering economics. You really have to factor in it's doing the basic, but also I have to think about my municipal solid waste and what opportunities are there. I potentially have to interface with the natural gas utility, especially if I'm producing RNG. There are power utility coordination for CHP projects, food and beverage, industry coordination. Industrial agriculture is huge. There's a huge amount of opportunity in industrial agriculture now with building, some are showing literally thousands of anaerobic digesters that could be built to leverage those markets. Traditional renewable energy coordination, industrial wastewater, and even transportation and car manufacturing because of some of the proposed rules in the Renewable Fuel Standard, and of course the biofuels program and their association with the oil industry. So there's just a lot of integration of this, and you really want your service provider to have a good understanding of how these different entities work. And so these interdisciplinary areas are extremely important, I think, in order to really get a comprehensive view of what the opportunities are and how they're going to impact your facility. This process flow diagram is intended to really show a couple things. It's quite complicated, but the convergence and co-processing, or at least co-management of a bunch of these different substrates that are identified on the left-hand side of the stream and how they could be processed. But central to this is anaerobic digestion and biogas utilization. And this, regionalization of these programs, provides flexibility. It provides opportunities and resiliency. It makes it more robust. Oftentimes, the economies of the scale make it more affordable. You have people who are dedicated to managing these programs, and so the affordability is more certain. These are proven approaches that in other areas of the world where integration has happened, you can see the economies of scale and the benefits of this regionalization. The diversity of products also provides a lot of stability as well. So there's a lot of good reasons for regionalization and integration. And finally, we need a lot of people in a lot of areas focused on this, and kind of humbly working together to make all this happen. From an engineering standpoint, it's almost like a plea for help. We need a lot of people focused on really competent planning and design of anaerobic digestion systems, as well as biogas utilization planning and design. I think that anyone who has some expertise or has interest in this area, huge opportunities for you to exercise those attributes. And then, these other areas like organics handling, the pre-treatment, especially on these material recovery facilities, the design of those is, I think, evolving quickly, and we need individuals with that. Just traditional residuals management, solids liquid separation technologies, understanding how to deal with side streams and treating those is critical to the viability of these, because we can't compromise the effluent quality of these systems or the pretreatment requirements that they need to meet. And the byproducts on the back end that can be recovered and reused are huge. There's a huge market in this. We're doing okay in the US, but there's a huge opportunity to build on that so that we can move towards 100% reuse of our wastewater residuals and other residuals associated with organics processing. And with that, I appreciate your attention. Hopefully I've kept it, and we'll take whatever questions we have time for at this point.
Great, thanks, Drew. Great topic today. We have a number of good questions here already, so let's go ahead and get started with some of those. How quickly will these incentive programs roll out?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, well, the Renewable Fuel Standard is well underway, and if you're producing renewable natural gas, you're in good stead. If you're planning on leveraging the ERIN program for credits, there's some uncertainty around. To me, it's when, it's not if, it's when. Hoping that program will get activated yet this year, but it could be another couple of years before it does. Hopefully we'll have some more clarity on that going forward. For the Inflation Reduction Act, the guidance documents that are forthcoming should be here in the fall. For facilities that are contemplating or are kind of on the fence but want to go forward, for RNG projects, get them going, because these incentives are real and they're significant, but getting them, showing that you have construction initiated before the end of 2024 is going to be critical for that. For biogas electricity, I think you have a little bit more time, but nevertheless, there are reasons to get those going sooner rather than later, in addition to just the overall environmental benefits and the contribution to greenhouse gas reduction that we all should be focused on.
Okay. What happens if there is a dramatic change in the incentive programs?
Well, as I mentioned, I think that you have to sort of plan that. I think you work those different scenarios, and there's a number of different ways to manage this from a planning and decision-making standpoint. I think there are ways to mitigate those risks, but you need a backup plan in place. If the incentives go away, what does that look like? At least and the stakeholders that are associated with the decision that you invest in, they need to be clear on those as well and what the risks are associated with them. It appears that these incentive programs are solid, they're in place. They are subject to political winds, so you just need to be aware of that. But many of them are going to be tough to change going forward. So again, we're not just wastewater process engineers, we're not just environmental engineers, we're not just scientists. Now we have to really understand these other programs. We need to work with our partners in the legal realm, in the accounting realm, the brokers, and the individuals who have good expertise in the trading space as well. You know, it takes a team to really pull those together.
Great, thanks, Drew. It seems like there is a ton of incentives available for the US. Are there equivalent programs being developed for incentives in Canada as well?
I think Canada is looking at those incentive programs. In British Columbia, some of the incentive programs have already taken place, but it seems to be on a province by province basis. So you see British Columbia and Ontario taking the most aggressive steps to incentivize these programs, but the way they're being approached are slightly different. I will say some of the U.S. programs, Canada is eligible for, so don't rule that out if you're in Canada that you can't necessarily, you aren't able to take advantage of some of the U.S. incentives. But nevertheless, yeah, I think that Canada is in a way on a province by province basis. They're examining what their goals are based on the circumstances associated with each one and the values and implementing programs for those. And those will continue to evolve as well.
Thank you. With other innovative technologies coming into play, will conventional technologies such as anaerobic digestion be viable?
Yeah, this question comes up a lot, and in the context of treating recalcitrant chemicals such as PFAS and so forth, moving to different types of approaches have been really at the forefront of these discussions. I guess, you know, my broader guidance to this group and my clients in general is that anaerobic digestion is a very proven technology, and it's a very efficient way to stabilize residuals as well as derive energy from them without losing some of the nutrient quality. What happens upstream and downstream of anaerobic digestion is where I think the innovation is going to occur. But if you have any questions about the viability of anaerobic digestion and the biogas utilization associated with it, I honestly wouldn't worry about that as a viable technology. I'd focus more on, yes, I'm going to have this. If I'm not big enough, I'm going to look for ways to regionalize. And I go confidently forward with implementing and keeping my anaerobic digestion and making it as high performance as possible.
Thanks, Drew. Okay, and with that, we are going to wrap it up today. We've hit the hour. Thank you, Drew, and thank you all for your participation. If you have any other questions for Drew, his contact info is in the chat. You will receive an email shortly with a link to download your participation certificate. We will also be posting this presentation on stantec.com if you'd like to listen again, as well as share with a colleague. Our next presentation will be on Wednesday, September 20th, where our panel will be talking about water reuse and its role in the circular economy. We hope you can join us again soon.
Thanks.